Thank you for the invitation, Skylar in particular, for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I recall with some, oops, what do we do here? What happened? Missed this out. I don't know, what did we do? I recall with some fondness a long cab ride that Skylar and I took one time in Croatia, in which we, out of the, I think, sheer boredom of the 4-hour taxi ride back to the airport, came up with several interesting speculative proposals for programmable matter, including, as I recall, kind of using the distributions of astronomic constellations as a memory storage arrays, something like that. Yeah. So my talk today is a bit more philosophical than some of the others, and I think I hope this will be useful in this way. I tend, as a writer, as a theorist, I sort of think that at this point, the moment in which we think of philosophy as something that might be applied to the questions of technology, in certain ways may need to be reversed. At this point, that in certain ways our technologies are ahead of our capacities to conceptualize their implications. And so maybe part of the reason that some of our work doesn't have the impact on the world that we would like it to at scale is as much of a problem of conceptual models as it is of mechanical models. Since that time, when Skylar and I had this conversation, MIT Press has recently published a book of mine called The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, for which some of the practical design issues of programmable matter are central to a theory of the geopolitics of planetary scale computation, and its, in turn, its impact on what we might call geodesign. There's two key arguments of the book. One is that planetary scale computation both distorts and deforms traditional Westphalian logics of political geography and creates new territories in its own image. And that these different genres of computation, smart grids, cloud platforms, mobile apps, smart cities, IoT, automation, et cetera, can be seen not as so many species of computation evolving on their own, but as forming a kind of coherent whole. These technologies align layer by layer into something like a vast, if also incomplete, pervasive, if also irregular, accidental megastructure, which we call the stack, a computational apparatus and a new governing architecture at the same time. It is comprised of ecological flows becoming sites of intensive sensing, quantification, and governance, of cloud platforms spurring platform economies, creating virtual geographies in its own image, for which we see contemporary cloud platforms sometimes absorbing traditional core functions of the state and vice versa. Cities forming vast discontiguous networks as they weave their borders into enclaves or escape routes. Virtual addressing systems locating billions of entities and events into unfamiliar maps. Interfaces presenting vibrant augmentations of reality, standing in for extended cognition. Users, both human and non-human, populating this tangled apparatus, this accidental megastructure in which we find ourselves. In that book, as well as the one that I'm writing now, I call for a materialism that is perhaps more closely tuned to the philosophical provocations of actual matter itself, especially what we now know about matter's programmability that we did not know until recently, which I think has some profound effects for how we might understand ourselves as well as matter. And so we would re-ask the question of how it is that matter may assemble itself into a form that produces effects that we would recognize as intelligence, including the frontal cortex of Homo sapiens, but also how it assembles itself as AI, either other non-carbon-based forms of intelligence. And so in terms of programming matter, we're interested, that is, in a kind of geology of AI. So first, planetary scale computation involves the entire Earth in its operations, from which silica, steel, and all matter of conflict minerals are drawn. Computation, that is not virtual. It is a deeply physical event, and the stack has an enormous appetite for molecules of interest and distributing them into our pockets, our laps, and our landfills. The chemistries and terawatts that feed the stack and us through it force us to reckon that the ponderous heaviness of the cloud will be a key driver for geopolitical frictions to come. Will the platform efficiencies of the stack provide the lightness necessary for a new subtractive modernity, an engine of a sustainable counter-industrialization, or will its appetite finally suck everything into its collapsing cores of data centers buried under mountains, the last race, the climate itself, the last enemy? And regarding the materials at work, silica, of course, is the least of the problem. Billions of earthlings everywhere carry little bits of Africa around with them in their pockets. The stack terraforms the host planet by drinking and vomiting its elemental juices and spitting up mobile phones. Any bit of matter, or even those more prosaic, is furthermore dependent upon sensing apparatuses capable of transforming biochemical events into data, such that other media could assemble these into descriptive, which may then descriptive models, which then may provide for predictive models in turn. And so the extrapolation, if you like, of planetary surfaces as epidermis has long been linked with the conceptualization of climatic measurement and prediction, for example, such as the history of weather. Programmability resides, we might say, in that layer between the original and artificial planetary computers and the plasticity by which one might affect the other. When a material public is based on a truly ubiquitous computational infrastructure is formed, the political formulations that would cohere might be based on the aggregation of encounters and relationships between persons and things and material events, including especially those in which people are not directly involved. But even if everything is seen and registered in this way, not everything sees or works back on what it sees in the same way. And so economics enters. From gold standard to carbon pricing to the energy bill for Bitcoin miners, we are quickly confronted with the fundamental questions of how matter and energy may contain, cohere, represent, guarantee, or exchange value. That is, with blockchains, we may, in theory, induce currencies that refer to energy expenditure necessary to calculate them into existence. And to the extent that they are at least provisionally programmable, we have then currencies that defer their apparent lack of materiality by deferring into hardware instead of tokens. That is, energy itself may not be programmable directly in this way, but currencies that represent energy expenditures can be. And so for a more speculative eco-economics, perhaps the lesson for carbon is to make, the lesson for us is to make the carbon chain more ubiquitous, expanding the scope of the sovereign wallet to include composite users that are, as well, the major carbon sinks. Part of the design question, we may say, has to do with interpreting the status of the image of the world that would be created by this kind of program, as well as that mechanism's own image of itself and the way that it governs the planet by governing its model of the planet. That model is built on the interrelationship, as I say, between non-human biologies and chemistries as much. And so the images that the designer can deduce and produce serve as well for the representational agency of matter that otherwise would be invisible to itself beyond its most local chemical interactions. As our next then, we would want to ask after intelligence, computation and matter, how computation has become a kind of solvent in which the particular forms of algorithmic reasons dissolve into matter. We take it then that computation was discovered more than it was invented, or at least as much as it was invented. And we take it that it is one of the ways that matter, in whatever form, achieves intelligence through procedural abstraction. Among these, sapient brain tissue is another way that matter has achieved intelligence in ways that are both clearly and clearly not computational in the conventional sense. And we take it that the solution, or this dissolution of synthetic computation into matter, our software into urban fabric, provides the landscape of inorganic forms a sort of distributed intelligence because it provides them for the capacity for abstraction. That is, intelligence as abstraction, computation as intelligence, computation as abstraction. So this perspective, I think, should account for at least two, but probably rather different understandings. One would recognize that intelligence and knowledge is always distributed among multiple positions and forms of life, both similar and dissimilar to one another, and that no single neuroanatomical disposition has a privileged monopoly on how to think intelligently. What might qualify as intelligence is not duty-bound to species or phylum, nor in its capacity for abstraction. The ability of any organism, however primitive, to map its surroundings, particularly in relation to the basic terms of friend, food, and foe, is a primordial abstraction from which we do not graduate so much as learn to develop into something like reason and its local human variations. So, like protozoa and their cilia, feeling about to figure out what's out there, or like humans looking and tasting and imagining patterns, today's forms of AI are sometimes augmented by various technologies of machine cognition, machine sensation, machine vision that allow them to see and sense the world out there and to abstract the forms of a mechanically embodied intelligence, but deliberately programmed and emerging unexpectedly. And in time, should complex general AI arrive, it would not be human-like unless we insist that it pretend to be so, because one assumes the idea that intelligence could be both real and inhuman at the same time is somehow morally or psychologically intolerable. Instead of nurturing this bigotry, we would do better to allow that in our universe, thinking is a much more diverse, even alien phenomenon than our own particular case. The real philosophical lessons of AI then will have less to do with humans teaching machines how to think than with machines teaching humans a fuller and truer range of what thinking can be. But first, I wanted to deal a bit deeper into the question of AI, not so much AI in a petri dish, or AI as if it were a kind of synthetic philosopher, but rather AI as a landscape-scale enterprise for which information sensing and processing exist in complex economic niches. Even or especially because AI evolved back and forth between real technology and philosophical experiments, AI's epistemic and urban careers cannot be disentangled except through rather artificial conditions. That is, if intelligence is one way that matter organizes itself into durable complexity, then the special form of that complexity is the city, a settled accumulation of material intelligence, both human and inhuman. And so as AI becomes more sophisticated, what will be its urban project? We try to see the AI not in terms of how we think that we think, as a sort of virtual human cognition serving us, but rather as thinking, rather as thinking and embodying another spot than we do on a larger and shared continuum of material intelligence. This is, as I've hinted, fundamentally bound up with sensing. With urban scale network arrays and attendant AIs, we see that the boundaries between where sensing stops and information processing begins is very muddy. Sometimes, like with the skin of cuttlefish, the thinking happens in the skin. Sometimes, as with various nano and bioengineering, a point of important conversion between bits and atoms is how matter, and sometimes new materials, that can be designed to sense or arguably interpret their scope and sphere. At the urban scale, this synthetic biosemiosis blends with those already at work. In many cases, the pairing of synthetic sensing, vision for example, with evolutionary robotics allows for simple artificial species to perform intelligence because they have what amounts to a functionally embodied perceptual model location in the world. The heuristic model of the habitat is inseparable from how the AI manipulates the situated problem space. They think because they can see. Now, the city, any city, is home to millions of species, from microbes to insects to vegetation to sapient mammals. It's a living bacteriological and immunological tumult, a situated ecology of predation and symbiosis, competitive and sexual selections across multiple scales. And now we insert landscape scale sensing and evolutionary robotics into this. The AI city may be embodying itself, but not as humans do. It is a commingling of diverse sensors of light and air and sound and chemistry, drawing a landscape of sensing and thinking little species, partially embodied discretely with one another, partially co-embodied with one another, as their information inputs are aggregated and modeled and acted upon in various pluralities. Homo sapiens come equipped with an extraordinary array of sensory faculties, which may, as we know, be further augmented by synthetic layers in various ratios, ranging from the sensors and trackers in our phones that we carry about like mules, to more intimate media of artificial images and sounds. Situating ourselves in this expanded field, we are both sensors and sensed. On the one hand, we are a primary sapient actor in this drama, supervising an orchestra of sensing technologies, each individually capable of functional processing, and together of certain forms of emergent intelligence, as are neurons or other cells. On the other, we are not only the subject of this scenario, we are also its subject matter. That wider urban landscape of synthetic sensory systems is not only a platform through which we extend and extrapolate our capacities for abstraction, it is also capable of other sorts of abstractions on its own. And so it's not just AI in the city, but nested AI co-embodied as the city, but based on a very different organism to signal to niche, to population, to genome dynamics and structures at work. In short, we should imagine an AI urbanism in terms of von Uschkal's stroll into the field populated by intermingling but mutually oblivious little life worlds, and or in terms of Deleuze's parable of the tick, the later laying in wait for some threshold event to come its way, at which point it triggers its programmed response out into its own little void. Many of our urban sensors and their limited forms of AI work in a similar way and with similar nobility. More versatile synthetic intelligence occupy more complex Umwelt. Some are predator and prey, some are in motion, some are flowering, some are pollinating. And as we stroll among them, we may be registered by them or we may be ignored. We may be a primary cause of concern, or we may be passing interference in an evolutionary dynamic in which we are neither protagonist nor target. The cities we build are in this way not only the habitat, again, about which AI may learn contextual knowledge, they are the distributed sensor apparatus with which an AI embodies that context. The city layer of the stack as platform and its governing apparatus is self-incorporating in this way. And so simultaneous with the collapse of biodiversity in other contexts, we also see at least the strong potential for an explosion of new species taking form through robotics, synthetic biology, and AI. We can't, of course, see the latter as replacements for the former, and yet there they are. I'll close with a couple other remarks. Another thing I would have perhaps shared if given more time was a short story that I'm writing now on a project to teach disappearing human languages to AI that might hold them, instead of a seed bank, a kind of ontology bank. Until then, I'll conclude with these thoughts. In Stanislaw Lem's and Tarkovsky's Solaris, the surface of the planet's ocean was sentient, as you know. Here on planet Earth, the strategy towards sentience includes layered networks of neurons in the folded gray matter of animal brains, particularly but not exclusively the cerebral cortex of primates, namely humans. We are, as Nikolai Fedorov wrote over a century ago, the matter in medium through which the planet thinks. Having folded some of its matter into the shape of brains and waiting a few million years for these blobs to sort it out, one of the things the Earth recently figured out is its own age, 4.7 billion years old, a competent figure for which came as late as 1953, the same year that Beckett premiered Waiting for Godot. We, as the Earth's digestive residue, were able to discover and know the planet's own duration. Quite impressive considering how for most of our existence we thought that the planet ran on our time. So was this project, in which the Earth formulated from itself a biochemical intensity, aka humans, that would prove capable of figuring out how old it is, worth the cost? We could deduce the age primarily through the geologic project sourcing data through mining. A Faustian bargain to top it all. Was discovering the fundamental truth worth exhuming millions of years of pre-Mesozoic biomatter for a 2-century fuel supply and inauguration of mass extinction? I asked my students if they thought it was worth it, and they were split. Perhaps, though, the more pertinent question would be what would make it worth it? Must the accomplishment of this Copernican epistemic disenchantment destroy or at least threaten that which it knows? Is this a necessary outcome? Or is this only a kind of provisional damage that would make for a more durable relationship between knower and known? And what of desire, then? The tropes of eros and thanatos, our other relationship to matter, are probably deceptive. It is not, I think, a sad destiny to be interwoven with alien matter. Other diagrams are possible, anatomic and economic. Our own bodies in and as this earthly landscape of matter are only the default settings, you might say. They are not destiny. Chemistry, as usual, may ultimately drive the most radical forms of the political and philosophical imaginary. A culinary materialism, yes, rubbing the clinamen raw. Arguably, the Anthropocene itself is due less to technology run amok than to the humanist project that understands the world as having been given for our needs and created in our image, the experience of our experience taken as the more essential value. Among other things, this makes it far too difficult to see the inevitable, whether we want it to or not, geoengineering, geodesign project for what it really is or what it should be. That is, something more like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale. A restored and resorted ecology designed to taste itself in new forms of richly spiced and imaginatively sauced mutual ingestion. A last word before tomorrow. When confronted directly or indirectly with the promiseless implications of ecological indifference to cultural traditions, hominids will vote for sovereigns who promise to bind them back together somehow, and who claim powers to make reality obey the tribal narrative. By rituals of public voice, these arbitrary yarns are apparently made real through a magical politics of representation and identification. What Carl Schmitt called political theology comes into its own when the function of the state is to provide what amounts to a religious plot line. As publics and polities are drawn by regional myths and hemispherical Grossraum, we literally vote for mind over matter. Matter, however, is unconvinced. Or in other words, a fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The claim was even greater. I think that's how the world will end, will come to an end, to general applause from wits who believe it's a joke. Thank you.